Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today. My name is Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches and your host today. One of my favorite bands is U2, and when I was a teenager they were pretty hot. As a matter of fact, when I was a young teenager, I think their album Joshua Tree won a Grammy Award, and off of that album there was a song called Pride, which is one of my favorite songs that they did, and some of the lyrics on it go: early morning, April 4th, shot rings out in the Memphis sky. Free at last, they took your life. They could not take your pride. In the name of love, what more? In the name of love. In the name of love, what more? In the name of love. That kind of was my first exposure to a man named Martin Luther King. I didn't know that the lyrics were about him and his death, but I had to kind of research it because it was just such a intriguing line. And at about that time too, they started talking in politics about wanting to inaugurate a day commemorating the life and the work of Martin Luther King. So it's always been a part of my story, is just trying to understand why Martin Luther King was important and why we should be celebrating a day in his memory. And so what do you think? Why should we be celebrating a day in honor of Martin Luther King?
Oh, wow. One of the things I remember is that question being raised during that time, and the advocacy for a King Day. What King stood for, what Dr. King stood for was peace. What Dr. King stood for was justice. What Dr. King stood for was equality. And so the work that he did was an opportunity to commemorate not just the man and the individual, but the legacy in not just the African-American community, but in the country. Because the movement that he was a part of did affect this country. And so that was the thrust behind advocating having a King Day during that time. And so it's quite important to reflect on where we were and what happened and the things that took place during that time.
You have any thoughts on that, Linda?
Yeah, I think King's life was sort of a turning point for all of us, not only in this country but also in the world. Mm-hmm. I think in many ways he was a very nonviolent person, and I think at the same time, the United States was seen by the world as not quite the place we always wanted to project that we were.
That's true.
We were this democratic nation where everybody was treated equally, and he made the world, he helped the world realize that no, that's not true. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of discrimination in this country. I think people living in the North were quite unaware of life in the South, and that's one reason I chose to go to the South for a semester. It was a turning point, and here was a man who was revered by everyone because of how he lived his life and how he projected what was happening in this country.
And it is important for the nation, not just for the time period itself. There's been a continued legacy that's emerged from the life of Martin Luther King.
Definitely.
And that the whole idea that that we have civil rights for African Americans, or we have even in some ways the women's suffrage movement, and Frederick Douglass was big in that, as well as other. There was a coalescing, so to speak, of rights language. What does it mean to be a citizen of the country? And that was something that I think that King really helped us understand, is that whole citizenship thing.
I think he did, and also that was followed up by passage of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, a Voting Rights Act, that we are a nation where everyone should have the right to vote, even though we sort of believed it anyway. It really didn't happen because of the Jim Crow laws in the South. But he worked hard with Lyndon Johnson, tried to work with John Kennedy before that to make sure that legislation was passed so that this country really could live up to the ideals it continued to espouse around the world.
And my guests today are the Reverend Dr. Greg Johnson. Greg, it's nice to have you back on To Encounter today.
Thank you.
And my other guest is Dr. Linda Biemer. Linda is a historian and was a BU academic dean for a number of years. And thank you for coming on Encounter to help us talk a little bit about the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. Now, Linda, you had alluded to the fact that you had been in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I went to Spelman College for black women. I was an undergraduate student at Elmira College up here, and we had an exchange program. A few colleges, northern colleges, did have exchange programs with Elmira, so I took the place of a student at Spelman, and a student there took my place at Elmira. Biracial exchange program is what
And Spelman is in Atlanta?
Spelman's in Atlanta, Georgia, yes. It was considered, the premier African-American college for women at the time. I spent a full semester there. I chose to go because I wanted to have the experience of living in the South. I had been brought up in New York, always lived in New York. I was very much interested in the entire civil rights movement, and I felt I could go there and do things that would help me, one, understand life in the South, but also work with African Americans in the South. And I was able to do that. I worked a lot after I took classes. Yes, I did. I was enrolled as a student, but in the evening and on weekends, I worked a lot on voter registration and in some of the marches about voter registration and civil rights. So it was actually, Joe, it was the highlight of my undergraduate career.
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
Really was.
And I see a bulletin on the top there, and it says Ebenezer Baptist Church, and as a fan of Martin Luther King Jr. and Sr., that's a cool, something really neat.
Yes. Well, last evening I got out my yearbook from Spelman, the year that I was there, and in it there were several things I had saved that I actually had not looked at in a few years. And one was the church bulletin from the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which I attended as frequently as I could. My student friends at Spelman would always know when he was going to be there to preach.
They knew that.
Yeah. And we knew most of the time Daddy King was there. So we would go there to listen to him. He was a dynamic speaker as well. He was louder and more active than Martin Jr., the son. But we enjoyed both of them. So I did attend Ebenezer Baptist Church. I had met Martin Luther King the times he was there, because he always greeted people at the end of the service. Also the same with his father, Martin Luther Sr. All my friends there called him Daddy King. And also I did attend some white churches as well, because I wanted to try to get the other view of the South.
So what did you think of the other view of the South at the time?
Well, it was interesting. I had read about black, white, or men, women, and colored in restrooms, and I had never seen that before. And it was real, and that sort of blew me away, that's how people were being treated. I remember going to the white churches, and a couple of the other white exchange students and I would go to the white churches. And it was very interesting. They had like college-age Sunday school classes, and we would go to those because we wanted to interact with people our age and find out what their thinking was, and was it different from ours, and if so, why? And so everything was fine. You know, we'd introduce ourselves and we'd start talking. It's like, well, why are you in Atlanta? Where are you? What are you doing here? Where do you go to college? And we would say, oh, we're at Spelman. Dead silence. No joke. I mean, we were just so taken aback by Spelman. You know, why are you at Spelman? And then we would say why we were at Spelman. But it, you know, we wanted to say, aren't you Christian? I mean, isn't this what?
So that experience, how did that impact you? That's a question it just came to mind as you were sitting there, and people who look like you, and you say you were at Spelman, and dead silence. How did that impact you?
Meant I had a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Meant I had to talk with more people and try to understand them and have them understand me, because it was very different for them. Most of them hadn't talked with Northern whites.
Right.
They'd heard of us, you know, damn Yankees and all of that. It was similar to some of the black students at Spelman, however. I remember some of my classmates at Spelman telling me I was the first white person they had ever talked with.
Oh, wow.
That sort of blew me away as well, really. Yeah, you know, they grew up in a black community, they went to black churches, they went to black schools with discarded books from the white schools, so one of my friends from Chattanooga told me. And it was like, there's a lot of work here to do. I can't do it in one semester.
Right.
You know.
Now, Greg, you and I are similar in age, and so we don't have firsthand understanding of the life of Martin Luther King. He sadly died before I was 4 months old, I think, at the time, and you were similar in age. So, what is the life and legacy of Martin Luther King, especially as a black minister? What has this meant to you in your ministry?
One of the things that I take away from the life and legacy of Dr. King is the fact that his work is grounded in the gospel. You know, there have been quite a few public figures who have been challenging to the world. I think King's message, King's work, being anchored in the gospel and the teachings of Jesus Christ is what, one, set him apart from other leaders. Two, for me, it helps me to see that this work, you know, oftentimes in the ministry, you're like, oh, this is hard work, you know, will you ever get people to understand? But you see King's life and the legacy that has been left, and you see that the work, even though he's not here, the work and the message still goes on. And so one of the most impactful things, I had the opportunity to read one of the books of King, quite a few, but one of the books made an impact. Where do we go from here? Community or chaos? And I think that book in what was it, 62, 63, that book at the time was ahead of its time.
It was.
You know,
in a lot of ways, yeah.
Because what he was talking about then is where we are now.
Right.
Community or chaos, you know, and I think the gospel has a place in helping us understand what community is and how we can be